morning, Year 11. So we're continuing with our work on question 4 today. So how many marks are available for paper 2 question 4? How long do you have to write your response? And what must you include in your response to question number 4, please? So in our last lesson together, we started having a look at the question for paper 2 question 4. Now we're going to do this one a little bit differently to how we've done the others. Usually, obviously, I'd get you to have a go first, then we'd have a look at a model answer. But I think it's important for you to understand how an answer should look to this question before you have a go at it. So just as a reminder then, for this question, you have to refer to the whole of source A together with the whole of source B. So it's not just one extract, it's a comparison of the two. It's asking you to think about how the writers convey their different perspectives on the extreme weather conditions that they're facing. So you've got to compare their perspectives, which is similar to question 2. You've got to compare the methods they use, which is similar to question 3. And you have to provide examples from both sources. So I've attached this YouTube link to our Show My Homework session today. And I just wanted you to have a watch of it, just so somebody else can explain it first. And then I could go over it in a little bit more depth. These videos are really helpful. Obviously, Mr. Bruffer's got a range of English literature and English language videos on YouTube. So if you feel like you're at a loose end or you need some help with revision, obviously, please do use these because they are a really easy method of revising the skills that are needed for these questions. So hopefully you found that video helpful and obviously a little bit more of an explanation into the question itself. So this is the mark scheme. So we're going to have a look at a model answer next, and I want you to think about what grade you would give this, okay? So in the most basic form of things, for you to get 1 to 4 marks, you've got to simply compare the writer's perspective. So you've got to say how they feel about the weather that they've experienced. You've got a simple identification of writer's techniques. So the word, so we've spoken about that, haven't we? It's really low level in terms of your annotations. And then you must pick quotations from both texts. So to get 5 to 8 marks, which I would say is our aim at that grade 4 standard, you need to attempt to compare the perspectives. So are they similar or different, but not always clearly. You make some comments on the techniques used by the writer, making some general inferences from quotations, and there's some appropriate quotations chosen. So they're not asking you to be able to say, well, they've used alliteration to present their negative emotions towards the weather. They're just asking you to be able to say, okay, so this makes me think that perhaps the person's not enjoying their experience, okay? And then higher up, obviously, it's about doing everything in a clear way, so making clear comparisons and clear inferences and analysing the techniques used. And then at the top of the band, obviously, it's about making perceptive comments and perceptive analysis and details from the quotations. Okay, so keep this in mind as we're reading through the model on the next slide, and I want you to have a think about where you would place that example. Here is a student's response to the question. I'm going to read it out to you because I know it'll be difficult for you to read on the small screen, but what I really want you to think about is what mark would you give this out of 16 based on the mark scheme that we've just had a look at in the previous slide. So it's the same question that we've looked at, so compare the writers' different perspectives on the extreme weather conditions. So source A, The Death Zone, is a 20th century non-fiction account of an expedition to Mount Everest. The author vividly describes their experience of the storm he endures. He describes it as a night from hell for the climbers, implying that the storm was not only immensely powerful and intimidating, but also related to faith, sin, and God. The image of hell indicates that the climbers have already died without their knowing, such is the power of the storm. It also adds stock to the implication that this storm acted as some form of vengeance by the gods to humanity for some grievous sin. It is described as an apocalyptic vision, and indeed for the climbers it does pose as a mortal threat. The storm isolates and terrifies each individual climber, every one of them fighting for their lives. Source B, London Snow, is a 19th century diary entry by one Arthur Mumby. He has a much more sedentary life than Matt Dickinson, the author of Source A. This is shown in his sense of endowment and romanticism of the snowfall he experiences in London. He holds a quaint view of the snow that influences his perspective as he goes. He describes the snow experience of loveliness and utter purity, quite adverse to the apocalyptic vision of Source A. This snowfall initially seems to have little effect on Mumby, but as the diary entry progresses, he comes across homeless people in the cold and becomes quite disenchanted with the whole affair. He later describes it in a more pessimistic sense. My heart seemed paralysed, shows how he feels the snow is fringing upon his quality of life, appearing to stop him functioning as best he could. Despite these apparent issues and annoyance, Mumby encounters were merely temporary inconveniences in the face of such mortal challenges Dickens and the climbers face daily. Naturally, Arthur Mumby holds no experience of mountaineering and therefore would not be subjected to fatal events. For Dickinson, the storm attacks the climbers as a constant bullying force, whereas Mumby, by contrast, has his beard frozen. Fatalities are the result of Everest tempest, but on the other hand, even those with little to no material shelter suffer relatively little. One such homeless girl claimed to feel as cold as a frog. This person, Arthur Mumby, portrays as a victim in his recount of the day, and he clearly pities her, but her struggles appear almost insensitive in comparison to the godly overpowering strength of the storm present to the mountaineers as both an apocalyptic vision and the combined forces of various destructive gods. So obviously this one is quite a high level response. I'm hoping you've had a think about how you would grade this, but this got full marks, so this was 16 out of 16 marks. So what we're just going to spend some time doing this lesson is just going through and looking at why they've achieved the top marks, but also thinking about how they've structured their response in order to achieve that amount of marks. So the first thing I want to highlight to you is we're going to have a look for this point here. So comparing their different perspectives on the extreme weather condition. Okay, so we can see the first bit of comparison comes here, where he says source B, London snow, is a 19th century diary entry by one Arthur Mumby. Mumby has a much more sedentary life than Matt Dickinson, the author of Source A. So that's the first comparison, and what he's saying is basically one is experiencing a much calmer version of life than the other. Okay, and then we can say here, so where he says he describes the snow experience as loveliness and utterly purity, quite adverse to the apocalyptic vision of Source A. There's a comparison there. He later describes in a more pessimistic view, appears to be stopping him functioning despite this apparently. So, despite these apparent issues and annoyance Mumby encounters, they remain mere temporary inconveniences in the face of such mortal challenges Dickens and the climbers face daily. So, naturally, Arthur Mumby holds experience of mountaineering and therefore would not be subjected to a fatal event. For Dickens, the storm attacks the climbers as a constant bullying force, whereas Mumby, by contrast, his beard freezes. And then, obviously, this bit here. So he's comparing fatalities, isn't he, to the homeless girl who was as cold as a frog. And then he kind of summarises it here by saying, you know, it's almost, you know, insensitive to compare the two because they're nothing alike. All right, so they've hit that first bullet point really well. Secondly then, so you've got to compare the methods the writers use to convey their different perspectives. So the first thing this person's done is they've named the type of text that's been used. So they said a 20th century non-fiction account of an expedition to Mount Everest. Okay, the author vividly describes their experience of the storm he endures. So they've picked out Night from Hell, implying the storm is not immensely powerful but also related to faith, sin and God. The image of hell indicates that the climbers have already died without their knowing, such is the power of the storm. Also adds to the stock implication that the storm arrived as some vengeance from the gods and a humanity for the grievance. An apocalyptic vision, indeed, the climbers does pose a mortal threat. The storm isolates and terrifies each individual climber. So they're doing everything that the question's asking, aren't they? They're picking quotations out, they're saying the imagery that's behind them. Notice they've not once mentioned a simile or metaphor and they've managed to get full marks, so don't be switched off from this question because of that. So here we can have, we have a look at his sense of adornment and romanticism of the snowfall he experiences. He has a quaint view of the snow that influences his perspective as he goes. The snowfall initially seems to have little effect on Mumby, but as the diary entry progresses, he comes across a homeless person, and he describes it as a pessimistic sense. We've spoken about that, haven't we? And it goes on. But really, in the grand scheme of things, they've not done anything that's any more difficult than what you've done in the previous question. They've simply compared them, haven't they, in terms of their dangerous nature. One is clearly more dangerous than the other. The only thing that this one does have going for it is the perceptive comments that it makes. So, you know, here where it talks about God and the sins. So here, so by God and humanity for some grievous sin, that sort of thing. This idea, obviously, the storm isolates and terrifies each individual, how he's the romantic view and adorning of the snowfall. They've gone above and beyond, haven't they? Their views are definitely considered to be perceptive. Okay. Hopefully this lesson has just given you a little bit more of an insight into, you know, what an answer would look like to this question. Obviously, because it's got so many different elements, that makes it quite difficult to be able to pin down how is best to answer the question. So next lesson, what we're going to have a look at is how to actually respond to a question like this, which format to use. Okay, so
you're doing mine, aren't you? Yes, Chuck. I don't think I have the one for the 8.
So just make sure that obviously you answer the show my homework quiz.